We are now in part 2 of our chapter 15 on the sensory pathways of the nervous system. Now we're going to talk about the general sensory receptors that you have. Now recall, these are not our special senses like sense of sight and hearing. These are going to be our general senses. With those, we can classify them in a couple of different ways. The first one that we're looking at is classification based on where the stimulus is coming from. So if we're talking about something that's coming from outside of our body that we're going to be detecting, that's an exteroceptor that is going to be picking up the stimulus to send it through our sensory neurons. If it's coming from inside our body and is providing us information about our visceral organs and what they're doing for their functions, those are interoceptors. Proprioceptors, on the other hand, are going to give us information about the position of our skeletal muscles and our joints. Functionally, we can look at the general sensory receptors in terms of what type of actual stimulus they're going to be able to detect. So we have 4 major categories that are going to be shown here, and then there are some subcategories that are going to be shown underneath it as well. Pain receptors are called nociceptors. Thermoreceptors are going to detect temperature, then there are going to be separate cold ones from hot ones. Chemoreceptors are going to detect chemicals that are going to be dissolved within some sort of fluid in your body. And mechanoreceptors are going to detect physical distortions that are occurring on the cell so that when there's pressure on it, the cell membranes are actually going to get distorted. When we talk about nociceptors generally have large receptive fields, and they are going to detect pain, and that pain is going to be generally in your superficial skin, your joint capsules, the periosteum of your bone, and even around your blood vessels. So that's where you're generally going to find these free nerve endings that are going to pick up the pain. They're going to be also sensitive to extreme temperatures. So when you have really hot or really cold, that actually triggers your pain receptors as opposed to your thermoreceptors. These are going to be tonic receptors. There is a little peripheral adaptation with it, but you can have central adaptation that can reduce the perception of the pain that's going to be there. So your receptors will be sending those signals if there is pain, but you can have some central adaptation, which is why people will perceive pain differently from one person to the next, because of the way that they adapt to it centrally within their spinal cord or their brainstem or their thalamus, to kind of reduce the amount of pain that they are going to be perceiving. You have different types of pain. You can have like fast pain, which is like if you have a cut or some sort of trauma that's going to happen, that's going to be generally a fast pain, and you're going to be carrying that on your type A fibers. And remember, those are your larger diameter myelinated fibers, so that the sensations are going to get there very quickly, and they're going to trigger your CNS to respond to it and gives you conscious attention to it. But you can also have slow pain. Slow pain is like a burning or an aching feeling, and you're going to have type C fibers that are going to be taking that information. The type C fibers, remember, are going to be very small in diameter and unmyelinated. Now, like I had mentioned before, the thermoreceptors are going to be detecting temperature. They're going to be located in your dermis, your skeletal muscles, your liver, and your hypothalamus are all going to have these thermoreceptors. They actually carry those sensations along the same pathways that we carry the pain sensations. And then you're going to have with these phasic receptors. So they respond to temperature changes, and then you have that adaptation that's going to occur where you're going to increase and actually cause the action potentials when the change is going to occur, as opposed to just constantly. Let's jump to the mechanoreceptors because I want to hit chemoreceptors last. The mechanoreceptors are very sensitive to a physical stimulus because they're going to be distorting the plasma membranes of the cells in some way. These membranes have those mechanically gated ion channels that are going to respond to stretching, compression, or twisting, some sort of distortion of that plasma membrane. We will have different types of mechanoreceptors. So starting on the right side, you see the tactile receptors. That's giving you your sensation of touch, pressure, and vibration. There's going to be different degrees of these and different very specialized receptors for each of them. You do not need to know the very specialized one. Baroreceptors are going to detect pressure changes. So it's a mechanical pressure and things are being distorted, but it's because the pressure changes are going to be happening. You're going to see this in your blood vessels in different parts of like your digestive, respiratory, and urinary tracts. And they're going to basically detect when organs to distend. And when they're getting distended, like a blood vessel, it will know that there is a change in pressure. The proprioceptors are also going to be another type of mechanoreceptor, and they're monitoring the position of your joints and your skeletal muscles. This is only found in your somatic sensations. You do not have visceral organs that have proprioceptors, so you can't sit here and think, oh, well, my pancreas is feeling like it's over here right now. Your viscera do not have those proprioceptors, but I could hold my hand up in the air and know, oh, well, I can feel that my elbow is extended beyond my head. The proprioception is going to be basically your muscle spindles that are going to monitor your skeletal muscle length and your stretch reflexes, and your tendons. It monitors your tendons and how tense they are, and then your joint capsules as well. So the joint capsules can detect the pressure, movement, and tension in that area, and so those will all give you a relative position of where different parts of your body are going to be. The chemoreceptors are going to be responding to chemicals. So those chemicals have to be dissolved within the body fluids. Looking specifically at chemoreceptors, here are some examples of the chemoreceptors that we have. We have chemoreceptors that are in our respiratory centers for our medulla oblongata. Remember, that was our vital center. We are going to be detecting changes in pH and carbon dioxide that are going to be in the cerebral spinal fluid. That is going to cause us to know that we need to change the pH if we have high levels of the CO2, and that will actually trigger us to adjust the rate and depth of our breathing because our chemoreceptors have detected that the CO2 levels are going to be too high. Our carotid bodies that we have over here, they are also sensitive to changes in pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen that are in your blood. They're going to trigger cranial nerve 9 to adjust your respiratory and cardiovascular activity depending on the pressure that you have within it, as well as looking at the changes in the carbon dioxide levels and the O2 levels of your blood. Your aortic body that's coming off your heart, this is the largest artery in your body, and it is sensitive as well to carbon dioxide and oxygen. So the chemicals that we're looking at are going to be generally those gases that are dissolved within our fluids, and we're monitoring the CO2 and oxygen levels. And then you can see with the aortic body, cranial nerve 10 is now going to cause us to adjust based on those levels. So all of these are reflexive things where we need to change how our body is going to be responding in terms of how we're going to be breathing or output of blood depending on our CO2 and oxygen levels. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick review of a section of a spinal cord. So recall from chapter 13 when we talked all about the spinal cord itself is going to have both gray and white matter. That gray matter is going to have that butterfly shape within the center of it, and then you're going to have the white matter that's going to be surrounding it. And then remember, we have nerves or mixed nerves that are coming into all the different segments of the spinal cord through the different parts of the vertebral column. The ganglion that you see here is going to be a mass of cell bodies, and then that's going to come in and go into the posterior side here. We can tell that this is posterior because right here in the front, we can see that anterior median fissure. The posterior median sulcus is also going to be in the center point on the back side. Remember your sensory information from your afferent division. So we have the information coming into the posterior side, that's sensory, going through the gray horns, and then of course we can see our central canal, which is going to be located right there. With our white matter, we're going to have the different divisions of it as well. So we have the lateral white column, we have the posterior white columns back here too, and then we have where the gray matter is going across. We refer to that as that commissure, just like we have in the brain when you have the two parts spanning from the right to the left half, it's going to be your commissure. We are also going to have a commissure for the white matter. So both the gray and the white matter are going to have those commissures. The white matter commissure is going to be anterior, so it's going to be right in this front section right here, right where the anterior median fissure is going to be. So remember, our columns are going to be our white matter. Our gray matter is going to be divided into these different horns that are going to be part of this butterfly. Now, when we're talking about our sensory pathways, of course, we're talking about coming in through the dorsal root with the spinal ganglion, coming in here to the back section of the spinal cord. We have three major sensory pathways. We can see them labeled right here: the posterior column pathway, the spinocerebellar pathway, and the spinothalamic pathways. So remember, the whole point of this afferent division is you receive some information from a receptor. That receptor causes an action potential that's triggered through an afferent neuron. The afferent neuron is going to eventually come in and it's going to join into the spinal cord, into this back side of it through this posterior dorsal root area. Then from the spinal cord, we're going to take that information upward into the different parts of the brain to process the information. That's our sensory or afferent division. Depending on what the stimulus was, we are going to have different pathways that we are going to be taking. Remember that labeled line that we talked about where the receptor is going to have one particular stimulus, it goes through one particular pathway. So these particular pathways that we see are going to be the ones that are taking that type of information to the different parts of the brain. So in terms of labeling, yes, I would like you to know the different sections. So you have the labeling here with the posterior column pathway, and then in yellow you see the spinocerebellar pathway. And then in green, these are our spinothalamic pathways. And we're going to talk about each of these and what they're actually going to be perceiving and what kind of stimulus they're going to be picking up. Now, remember, we talked a little bit about this, how we have first, second, and third order neurons. First order neurons are the ones that are going to be attached and associated with our receptor. They are first taking that information from the stimulus, causing the action potential to go down them, and then they will synapse with the second order neuron. Generally, the second order neuron is going to be somewhere in the brainstem or the spinal cord. The third order neuron that synapsed with the second order neuron is then going to take information, generally starting either in the brainstem or the thalamus, and then it's going to take that information up to the somatosensory cortex of our cerebrum. Here are those sensory pathways. So in the last slide, we just looked at a cross section of the spinal cord, and then they were color coded according to those three different pathways that we have. So we have our spinothalamic pathway, our posterior column pathway, and our spinocerebellar pathway. Those names are going to tell you exactly where they're coming from. So the spinothalamic, spine, like spinal cord, to the thalamus. So it's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Posterior column is taking the white matter in those posterior column sections, and spinocerebellar is taking from the spinal cord and then going to our cerebellum. So do notice these first two pathways are going all the way up to the cerebrum, where you're going to have that somatosensory cortex that's going to process the information. Now let's talk about spinothalamic pathway first. Our spinothalamic pathway is what is giving us those conscious sensations that we are aware of, that we are able to perceive. So it's like our localized or crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. The information picked up by those receptors are generally going to be within our skin or within our muscles and our joints. So we're going to take that information, it's going to go through a receptor causing an action potential that goes through our afferent division, coming into the posterior side of our spinal cord, and then notice we have this crossing over that's occurring. So this red light that we're seeing, this is our first order neuron. So we can see our axon of our first order neuron coming in, and then that information crosses to the other side of the spinal cord. We refer to that as decussation. Decussation is when you have a crossing over of the information to the opposite side. So once we are on the opposite side now, it's going to take that information upward through the brainstem all the way up into the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, we're going to have that information going to the somatosensory cortex. Notice that here, going from the thalamus all the way to the somatosensory cortex, that's our third order neuron. Our second order neuron was taking the information all the way up the spinal cord, and it synapsed with the first order neuron that was going to take the information in from the opposite side. So again, we're always looking at the posterior side coming in, we're having decussation and crossing over at that second order neuron, and then we're going up through the spinal cord, up through the brainstem to hit the thalamus of the diencephalon, and then our third order neuron is going to take that information to our cerebral cortex, and our cerebral cortex is going to process that information. Notice there are actually two slightly different pathways just depending on what stimulus you're looking at. So crude touch and pressure, notice, are coming in and going through our anterior spinothalamic pathway. But then when we're looking at pain and temperature sensations, those are going through the lateral spinothalamic tract. So just relate that back to the labeling that we looked at, where the white columns are going to be and whether you're looking at the anterior or the lateral columns that are taking the information up. Now, one interesting aspect of that spinothalamic pathway is the phenomenon that we refer to as referred pain. Referred pain is going to be when you feel pain associated in one part of the body, but that's not actually where the receptor was picking up the pain sensation. We don't typically have our organs that are going to feel typical pain that we think of, like joint or skin pain. if that internal organ is sharing the same mixed nerve as that particular part of the body's surface, that part of the body's surface can exhibit pain symptoms even though there's no actual damage to the skin or the muscle. That internal organ and body surface are innervated by that same spinal segment. The classic example is like if someone is having a heart attack, that heart attack is going to be felt all the way up through the neck, sometimes the jaw, all the way down through the left arm. The pain in the left arm isn't actually a physical damage in the left arm, but that same segment of the spinal nerve that is picking up the information from the heart is also connecting where the arm is going to be on the left side. And so you're going to perceive pain in that left arm all the way up through the jaw because the heart is actually sending pain signals. It's just basically a way for our body to manifest visceral pain as a body surface pain so that you know something is wrong, even though we don't generally detect pain in our viscera. So you have that associated with the spinothalamic pathway in particular. You can also have what they refer to as phantom limb syndrome, where in phantom limb syndrome, you're having continued pain in an area that has actually been amputated. That labeled line still exists coming from the spinal cord and that pathway through to the brain. So even though you may not have that receptor anymore, the labeled line of that sensory neuron path that goes into the spinal cord up through the spinal cord through the cerebral cortex is still active. So you can have painful sensations even though they're not actually originating at a receptor, because that labeled line is still existing and still actively sending signals.